Hi, I'm James Michael Riley and welcome to Jim's Friday Freakout. See this saw? You'll notice it has a safety device that moves out of the way as you bring the saw blade down to cut the work and then drops back down again as the blade comes up to make sure you don't hurt yourself. This is the little piece of plastic tubing that I used to tie back this safety device when I was using the saw to build this house years ago. It was a case of exchanging short-term convenience for the potential of a long-term disaster. So unless you know that a meteor is going to hit the Earth tomorrow, don't disable your safety devices. Tonight, Jim's Friday Freakout looks at dead man's switches. The devices that step in to help us when we can't help ourselves, the horrible things they're supposed to prevent, and the doggone ways we get around them. Some of the first dead man switches were installed on trains. There's a guy named Sprague. Sprague was one of the pioneers of the streetcar industry in the United States. And he realized that if the operator running a streetcar on a city street were to become incapacitated, to fall out, to become unconscious, to die, whatever, there were only two things that were going to stop that streetcar. It was either going to derail or it was going to crash into something. Neither of those are very good options. So he came up with the idea of the first dead man switch. It was actually a dead man's pedal. It was something that the operator had to keep their foot on so that the electricity would flow, and if his foot came off it, the streetcar would come to a stop, and sometimes in later more sophisticated versions, it would even actually automatically apply the brakes. So these were then later applied to locomotives and others that weren't just streetcars. And now those devices have moved into the electronic realm, and they're called under the general category of alerters. Someone driving a train or locomotive today will be looking at a display screen, and that will give them a visual cue to do something every 90 seconds, something to indicate that he or she is still conscious and alive. It might be pressing a button, operating a lever, tapping the brakes, something. If they don't respond to that visual cue, then a chirping alarm sounds, and if they still don't respond to that, the system automatically throttles down and applies the brakes. Now, there's a writer for a website called machinerysafety101.com named Doug Nix, and he makes the case that we shouldn't call these dead man's or even live man's switches. Their purpose is to prevent injuries. But there's a hilarious interchange in a chat room for railroad professionals and aficionados. Somebody asked, was there a dead man switch in trains in the days when you were working? And somebody else responded, well, it was actually a pedal that needed to have a heavy lunch pail put on it. And then somebody else chimed in to say, well, no, it was actually better, instead of using your lunch pail, it was actually better to put one of the spare brake shoes that you had laying around the cabin of the locomotive, put that on there, so if you got in trouble and anybody called you on it, you could say, oh, it got on there accidentally. So, but I guess since I'm the one who tied back the guard plate on this thing, I'm really in no position to criticize. There was, however, a story where even when people do things right, dead man switches don't always work in the way that we hope they will. There's a story on criticaluncertainties.com about something that happened in Australia in 2003. A train going from Sydney Central to Port Kembla started going too fast on a downhill, which led to a curve. The train ended up derailing, and there were several deaths, many injuries, and the driver was killed. What they found out was that he was using the dead man's switch properly, which was, in his case, a dead man's pedal. But when he died, he fell in such a way that his weight went on the pedal, and the upper part of his body slumped across the control panel, knocking the accelerator to the high-speed setting. So these things do help, but there's certainly no guarantee. But elevators, boy, do they need dead man switches. But strictly speaking, the idea of a dead man switch would apply only to the old elevators where there was actually a human elevator operator that would make it run. And I actually, as recently as the early 2000s, was in an elevator in New York City that had a human elevator operator. That building has since been torn down. Well, things move on. The human operator, if they push the lever in one direction on this circular shaped control, it would make the elevator go up, the other direction would make it go down. But if they released it, perhaps because they became unconscious or died, the lever would spring back automatically to the central position and would bring the elevator to a stop. Not a bad idea. There's all other dead man's features on modern elevators. For example, what stops them from plunging in the event the cable breaks? Well, Elisha Otis, of the famous Otis Elevator Company that has put elevators into some of the biggest buildings in the world, including the Burj Khalifa, came up with a solution to this problem in 1852. I think we would not have high rises today if the elevator safety problem had not been solved. The idea is that the cable, or back in his day, the rope that held up the elevator car, also held back two arms that were under tension in a spring. And if the rope broke, the springs would push those arms open and they would move a tooth mechanism outward that went into notches in the guide rails, bringing the elevator by default to a stop. Now, the Washington Post pointed out in an article that this transitioned us to a related but distinct term since, like, as I said, elevators don't have human operators anymore. The idea of fail-safe. Not if the person dies, the mechanism saves you, but if one mechanism fails to work properly, another mechanism steps in to make it safe. So now cars are pulled by cables. This is elevator cars. And if those cables fail, brakes actuate on the guide rails on either side of the elevator shaft. But there is one way actually in which there are still dead man switches in an elevator, which is that, when you and I get on an elevator, we are the elevator operator. We press the button to call the car. We press the button to tell us where it goes. And when we're going from the outside to the inside, there's that mechanism in there that if we're standing in the middle, it senses we're there, either mechanically or through some sort of like electric I-beam, and causes the doors to open again. Although, speaking for myself, I can say it's really more of a bonehead man switch, because I usually just block those doors when I'm trying to get the elevator not to leave so fast. Industrial robots. Well, when you look up anything online today, the ads come first, and it's also true when you look up industrial robots. In fact, look at this ad here. $200 for one of these really cool robots like you see in an automobile factory. I want that in my house just as a decoration. But anyway, these go about their tasks according to a program, of course, but often human beings are involved in the production process in some way. And even if they're not involved in the moment-to-moment production process, humans are involved in training or programming these robots to do their jobs. They came up with a two-position enabling device so that the operator would hold it, and if they were struck by the robot and released it, then the robot would come to a stop. But they found that some people, when struck by a robot, boy, how many times are we going to be hearing that phrase in the news in coming years, they would release the control device and other people would grip it more tightly. So what they had to come up with was a three-position enabling device. In order for the robot to run, you have to hold it in the middle position. If you grip it too tightly, it stops. If you release it, it stops. Pretty smart. I would call that the Goldilocks solution. Not too loose, not too tight. Trademark me. So these devices are built into the side of what's called the Robot Teach Pendant, which sounds to me, a pendant just sounds like something maybe with one little switch on it that you clip to your uniform, but it's actually something like a really cool game controller. There are other kinds of dead man's switches that apply in industrial applications now. Errol Exports has a cool website. They are in the far north of India, and they just make things unapologetically called dead man's handles of many varieties that could be used in a lot of different applications. Nuclear power plants. I don't know if you've ever given any thought to how one of these things work, but the basic idea is that there is a containment vessel where there are fuel rods that are creating chain reactions among themselves. The way you control it is that control rods can slide into that containment vessel and they absorb the excess neutrons and slow down the reaction, or they bring it to a stop. Now, of course, you want safety protocols in place. You want dead man switches. So that if the power fails, gravity will drop the control rods into the containment vessel. But actually, you look at some of the designs and some of the control rods come up from the bottom, which is really strange to me. But in either case, springs will also actuate them. So if there's no power, those control rods will still come in and bring things to a stop. So a shutting down of a nuclear reactor is called a scram. Scram, as in we better scram, this thing's about to melt down. I think that's absolutely hilarious, but it's really not colloquial. On the Nuclear Regulatory Commission website, nrc.gov, the term scram is used there. In fact, I found an interesting letter on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission website where somebody wrote in with an idea about how to make them even safer, to add an additional fail-safe device. And that is to create the bottom of the containment vessel out of a material that doesn't melt at normal operating temperatures, but will melt at a lower temperature than a complete meltdown. So if the thing gets going too hot and all the other fail-safe dead man features stop working, the bottom of the vessel will melt and the fuel rods will drop down into little separate boxes that keep them from reacting with each other and will bring it to a stop. The interesting thing is that even though this is on the NRC website, this was sent in by a construction engineer who lives in Chicago that doesn't even work in the nuclear industry. And those sketches you're seeing there, those are his. He included them with his letter. Scram, this concept. There is a scram button in every nuclear facility in the United States. And the origin could not be less dead man's switch. It relied on several humans doing exactly the right thing very, very quickly. Now, I have this information from a reliable source, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory.gov website. Now, you're getting it fourth hand. You're hearing it from me, who read it on the website, where a guy wrote a story of what he was told by somebody who actually witnessed these events take place and actually participated in them. So if you want to get it third hand instead of fourth hand, go to the Oak Ridge National Laboratory website. So 1942, during World War II, when we were trying to make sure we got the bomb before the Nazis did, was the year of the first critical nuclear reaction in human history. It occurred at the University of Chicago in what is now known as the Stagg Field experiment, the Stagg Field pile reactor. In charge of this was an Italian physicist who had come over to work with the United States named Enrico Fermi. They had cadmium rods. These were their control rods, or I should say rod, singular, ready to drop in to this nuclear pile, secured by a rope, which would need to be instantaneously released if Fermi gave the signal. So what they did was they hired a lumberjack from the Northwest, and they flew him to Chicago, where he would stand beside the rope with an axe with a red handle, and if Fermi gave the signal, which was going to be a hand signal like this, he was to chop the rope. But the lumberjack pointed out that he was getting a stiff neck turning sideways to look at Fermi to watch for the signal, and also that meant he couldn't keep his eye on the rope, so he said, "Could you give me a verbal signal?" So this was during the dress rehearsal. So the next day when they came in to do this, Fermi came up with, he said, "I will say scram." And scram stood for Safety Cut Rope Axe Man. This was at the first critical nuclear reaction in human history. They had another backup plan, however. In case the guy with the axe didn't work, they had three people, one of whom was the person who related this story, who were standing on top of the nuclear pile with buckets of cadmium sulfate, another substance that could mediate the nuclear reaction. A guy with an axe and three guys with buckets. Welcome to the nuclear age. And it was at the University of Chicago on their athletic field in the Chicago city limits. Little twist on the idea of a dead man switch. I don't know if you've seen the movie Terminator 2, an Arnold Schwarzenegger sci-fi movie from 1991 about time-traveling assassin robots. Okay, so Miles Dyson, played wonderfully by Joe Morton, is the present-day guy who invents the technology that will lead to this horrible future where most of humanity is killed. So he decides, I've got to destroy all my work. And in the process of setting this up, the police get involved, they misunderstand, he ends up being gravely wounded. And in one scene, he is holding a switch where if he releases it, the whole place will blow up. And so he wants to make sure everybody gets away. So this is kind of a reverse dead man switch. Awful things will happen when I die, so everybody better scram. So anyway, going down the dead man switch rabbit hole was actually a lot of fun. I want to thank cheatsheet.com, the Chesapeake Southern Railway website.com, criticaluncertainties.com, nrc.gov, and many others. You see these safety glasses? In 1942, My father was working at a steel mill in Youngstown, Ohio when he was 14 years old during World War II. He was issued a pair of safety glasses, perhaps not unlike these, although his would have had glass, not plastic, in the lenses. And he was wearing them while he was using a heavy sledgehammer, but they kept sliding off his face, so he just left him hanging on a chain around his neck. One blow with the sledgehammer he was using hit him with a chip of stuff that hurt him through his jacket. So he said, I better put those glasses back on. And the very next blow with a hammer shattered the lens. Not worth disabling a safety feature for convenience. Thanks for listening. This has been Jim's Friday Freakout. See you next week.